When a child becomes a parent, two big transitions happen at once. The obvious one is that new parents are learning to care for the little life depending on them. The other transition, less often discussed, is at the grandparent level. New parents forget their own parents did all this before and succeeded. Whether they want advice coming out of that experience is another question entirely. Thankfully, many new parents are willing to listen, but with artificial intelligence within an arm's reach, many new parents will use that technology to vet whatever advice they receive. Which brings us not to something new, but something old, what philosophers call epistemology, the study of how knowledge is gained and truth is discerned. And that is one of humanity's oldest pitfalls. AI is only the most recent chapter. If we want to know true truth, we must listen to the words of Jesus. Welcome to Haven Today on this Thursday. I'm David Wollen, sharing the great story that's all about Jesus. We're in a series called Never Outgrow the Gospel. And it's key to living the Christian life. It's hardly a secret, but for many Christians, it's also hiding in plain sight. All over the pages of the New Testament, it's right there. The Lord is calling us to look to Christ afresh each and every day, to look again to the cross, to the source of our salvation, to remember that we've been saved, are being saved, and ultimately will be, and will come into the presence of Christ and be made perfect. But how? Well, it's by His grace, His power at work, not yours, not mine, but His. And it's so easy to forget that in the meantime, we're always in God's favor, in Christ. It's by grace and not because of our performance.
I found myself slipping back into a performance mentality to where the focus was back on me and trying to maintain or regain God's favor. And so I started reading Romans 5 daily, several times a day, just reminding myself of the fact that this is all of Jesus and I'm under God's favor at all times because of Christ and His righteousness that I'm now clothed with. And it has nothing to do with my performance. On my good days and on my bad days, it's all about Jesus.
Milton Vincent there, the author of a gospel primer for Christians. He'll be back with us momentarily. And if you were wondering, no, I'm not mispronouncing primer. That's the white stuff you put on your walls before you paint them. A primer, that's a British word. It's an introductory textbook for learning the basics of something and laying the foundation. The trouble is, as Christians, we hear that and might think, nope, don't need that. I learned the basics a long time ago. But if that were true, why would seasoned pastors be testifying that this was breakthrough for them, to learn, to rehearse the gospel daily, and that this transformed their walks with God? And it's the same for me. My copy of a gospel primer for Christians has a fixed spot. I keep it right next to the place where I pray each and every day, and I've reached for it many, many times. And you can get your own copy too. It's our thank you for your gift to support this ministry of Haven. And you can give by phone at 865-HAVEN, 865-HAVEN, or online at haventoday.org, haventoday.org. This is Haven Today. I'm David Wollen. How would you finish this sentence? What God really wants from me is what? What would you say? Would you have a public-facing answer, maybe for a Bible study or small group setting, something that sounded honest but still mature and biblical, and you'd expect other people to nod their heads in approval? But would you also have a private answer known only to you? What God really wants from me might feel synonymous with what God really thinks of me. And for you, that brings a sense of shame, like you're not measuring up, that God is always disappointed in you. Many believers feel that way and live in that tension, but it's unnecessary. And if it goes unresolved over time, it can actually spiral negatively into all kinds of different directions, not the least of which is a sense of guilt and burden and spiritual isolation. And if you can identify with any of that, just imagine carrying that load as a pastor, or Maybe today you are a pastor and carrying a load like that, which is why I want you to hear what Pastor Milton Vincent had to say about precisely this on a previous Haven Today series. And at this point in the conversation, he had just finished talking about how he'd finally gotten some breakthrough, how the Lord one afternoon had lifted his burden as he read through Romans chapter 5, but that sense of relief didn't last long.
Well, what I found was, as powerful of a moment as that was a decade ago in my house, reading Romans 5, I noticed that, like the next day, I found myself slipping back into a performance mentality to where the focus was back on me and trying to maintain or regain God's favor. And so I started reading Romans 5 daily, several times a day, just reminding myself of the fact that this is all of Jesus and I'm under God's favor at all times because of Christ and his righteousness that I'm now clothed with, and it has nothing to do with my performance. On my good days and on my bad days, it's all about Jesus. And so I found that I had to remind myself of that many times a day because it was easy for me to get out of gospel mode and to slip back into a performance mentality with God. But here's the deal. As I was keeping that doctrine, just the reality of God's grace having justified me in front of my face, I found like an incredible rest that had always eluded me before, and I found myself having enormous amounts of energy now to put into growing in holiness and ministering God's grace to other people. I had never had that much energy for ministry before because so much of my energy was consumed with tending to my status before God. But now I realize I don't have to worry about that anymore. I'm under God's favor at all times because of his grace. And so that's settled, that's taken care of. Jesus has taken care of that. Now I could just live in the good of this grace, enjoy it, and put my energies now into ministering this grace to other people and growing in deeper understanding of his grace. And I'll tell you one thing I like saying to myself during this time, because here's what I notice. As I just stayed focused on his grace, that I am accepted in Christ solely because of Jesus and what he has done and his righteousness, I found myself starting to change, and I wasn't even trying. I would catch myself making right choices, and I'm like, man, how did this happen? Well, obviously it was God's Spirit at work, but it was him working through the grace that was mine in Christ as I stayed focused on that. And one of the things I love doing is sometimes I'd be faced with a temptation that may have previously stumbled me, and I would look at that temptation and I would say to myself, you know what? I could commit this sin, and God's grace would abound to me all the more as he graciously maintains my justified status. But it's precisely for this reason that I choose not to commit this sin. And I would turn and walk away from sin with laughter in my heart. And that was a mystery to me at first, but I came to understand, even looking at Romans 5, that though justification is a once and for all act that happens at the moment of salvation, a continuous focus upon and celebration of this fact is a key. It's part of the fuel to sanctification.
This is Haven Today. I'm David Wollen, and that was the voice of Milton Vincent, the author of a gospel primer for Christians, and a clip from an interview recorded several years ago on Haven and addressing how the good news of the gospel and the truth of our justification, that is, through Christ, we have been, by faith, declared righteous before God. And that's not only important at the moment of salvation, that's a gospel truth that continues to work on us and work for us throughout our lives in Christ. But I can hear the questions forming in our minds in response to that. Could it really be that simple? Does that really work? What's an example of the gospel going to work in a Christian? And would that really make a difference in my relationship with Jesus or with other people around me? Once again, here's Milton Vincent.
If I'm really soaking in God's grace and I'm in awe over this forgiveness that he's given to me, like Paul, man, I have this, I'm under God's grace and I've been justified. And then in Romans 5, 1 through 11, at different points, he says, we exalt, we exalt, we exalt. 3 times he says that. So if you're really soaking in that and exulting and rejoicing in that, in God's forgiving grace that he's given to you, you're now prepared to handle when your wife or anyone else lets you down. As we're living in the good of God's grace and we realize, I am a sinner. I killed Jesus. My sins were the instruments by which he was crushed and pierced and killed. And yet at that spot where my worst deed was committed, God moved toward me with grace and forgiveness. And now this other person is wronging me or disappointing me. Their wrong against me is nowhere near my wrong against God. And if God has lavished his grace upon me, then how can I withhold grace from someone who may owe me a lesser debt or who has offended me in a far lesser way than how I offended God? So as we're enjoying his love toward us and walking in the fullness of that love, our hearts are being filled up, and from the overflow of that, we have love, we have grace, we have forgiveness to give to other people in our life. As we raise our children, we observe sin and brokenness in them, but we have an opportunity to come alongside of them as a brother or a sister and say, you know what? You have brokenness in you, and so does Dad, so does Mom. But it's okay to look at that. It's okay to admit that because we're safe in the love of Jesus. And in his embrace, as Christians, we of all people should have the most courage to look honestly and squarely at our sin and at our failure, because we know we're loved. So we don't have to hide in fear. We don't have to try to run ahead of our sin and try to excuse it or relabel it. No, we can look at it with raw honesty, knowing that we're safe in the Father's embrace and we're loved and we're accepted. He already knows the worst that there is to know about us. And yet, with full knowledge of us, he has moved towards us with love, forgiveness, and grace in Jesus. And that gives us liberty, and it gives us the courage to look honestly at our brokenness and our sin.
You're listening to Haven Today. I'm David Wollen, and the voice you just heard was that of Milton Vincent in a conversation recorded with Charles Morris on a Haven Today program several years ago. And he was talking from his own experience about what he does and about what his book helps us do, rehearsing the gospel daily. It's for our own good, and it's fuel for our walk with Christ. And Milton didn't set out to write this book. He set out simply to document for himself the journey the Lord was taking him on. And it's proven so helpful to so many people, including myself and my guest, Mike Bullmore, who wrote the foreword to the book and who has also been a guest this week on Haven. And hearing Milton Vincent talking about how it impacts your own ability to know and be known. Now I want you to hear what Mike Bullmore had to say about how the gospel actually frees us and enables us as Christians to love others well. Mike, I've come across this. I'm probably going to misquote it, but there's a lot of variations on it out there, even just on the bumper stickers of cars. It says something to the effect of, it's not Jesus I have a problem with, it's his followers. There's a reason that sort of resonates with people. But I've even heard at times, people inside the church say something along those lines. And we might think that, well, maybe that's how God, sees it, or how, maybe it's normal for us to see each other, but that's actually counter gospel in a pretty serious way. And in fact, the gospel speaks to that, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. In fact, what the gospel does is it puts flesh on the two greatest commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And so Milton actually does a great job with this. He's got as one of his meditations in the primer.
Right.
He's got one that's called Loving My Brothers and Sisters. I think it would be a travesty, David, if we did these segments without at some point reading from this book.
Yep, let's do it.
Yeah, let me just read a snippet. or two from this. I won't read the
Mm-hmm.
whole meditation, but this is called Loving My Brothers and Sisters. Milton writes, the more I experience the gospel, the more there develops within me a yearning affection for my fellow Christians who are also participating in the glories of the gospel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
With the gospel proving itself to be such a boon in my own life, I realize that the greatest gift I can give to my fellow Christians is the gospel itself. Indeed, I love my fellow Christians not simply because of the gospel,
Mm-hmm.
but I love them best when I am loving them with the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
He ends this little section by this: by preaching the gospel to myself each day, I nurture the bond that unites me with my brothers and sisters for whom Christ died.
Mm-hmm.
And I also keep myself well versed in the raw materials with which I may actively love them in Christ. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Not only does the gospel remind me of my union with these brothers, but it provides for me resource to share with other brothers and sisters who are on this, this challenging path called following Jesus. So I love that little section on loving my brothers and sisters, how the gospel helps me do that.
Yeah, yeah. And, there might be, too, some application here just as a bit of a litmus test. If I am finding that I have little love for my brothers and sisters in Christ, or even one step back from that, maybe I don't today, I can't say that with all sincerity before the Lord, but there still is within me a desire, or as Milton puts it, a yearning affection, or a yearning for a yearning affection.
Yes.
That says something about our own grasp of the gospel, and perhaps even where we are in our relationship with the Lord, for it to manifest itself in our hearts that way regarding those for whom he died and calls his bride.
Yeah. I think what you're pointing out is that we can kind of do a little reverse analysis here. And if we detect things in our lives that we sense are not as they should be, we can trace that back to some failure to actually apply the gospel, live in the good of the gospel. Ultimately, all Christian behavior should flow out of the gospel.
That's right. That's right.
So if there is some place where we're facing a particular struggle, I think it pays to ask the question, what dimension of God's work for me in Christ am I failing to lay hold of?
That's right. Yeah, because when we do, this is just quoting Paul from 2 Corinthians 3, as we're beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, that this is something that changes us. We are being transformed from into the same image from glory to glory, just as from the Lord the Spirit, or as elsewhere in the Psalms it puts it, you become like what you worship.
Yeah.
If we're worshiping Christ,
right,
the heart of Christ is going to be more and more manifest within us, inescapably.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mike Bullmore, thanks for being with us today.
Yes, thank you, David.
This is Haven Today. I'm David Wollen, and this is a ministry that only can share messages like the one you just heard because there are listeners like you who give. So when's the last time you partnered with the gospel message of Haven through a gift? It really does make a difference. And could I ask you today to make your gift? And when you do, I want you to benefit in a tangible way. I'd love to send you a gospel primer for Christians. It's by Milton Vincent. And you can give when you call us at 865-HAVEN. And again, that's 865-HAVEN, or you can go online to haventoday.org. Again, the website, haventoday.org. I'm David Wollen. Won't you come back again next time? We'll be keeping it all about Jesus. It's the great story here on Haven Today.